Coming up on today's show, Dr. Lahann is an AASECT Certified Sex Therapist, clinical psychologist, and speaker. She is focused on providing education, resources, and psychological services as the clinical director of Spectrum Psychology and Wellness in Gilbert, Arizona. Her work specializes in individual counseling and holistic sex therapy, focusing on intersectional approaches to values-aligned living across the lifespan. She has been involved in the BDSM, kink, ENM, and polyamorous communities for several decades and is a member of the National Coalition for Sexual Freedom and the Kink and Poly-Aware Professionals Directory. Welcome to Loving Without Boundaries, where we hear inspiring stories, share actionable advice, and talk about the challenges and the joys of ethical non-monogamy and polyamory. I'm your host, Kitty Shambliss. Coming up after the break, my conversation with Dr. Rebecca Lahann. Welcome back to Loving Without Boundaries, where I am really excited to be here with Dr. Rebecca Lahann, whom I had the honor and the privilege to meet at the latest Southwest Love Fest back in April of 2023, where I went to her workshop, Are Your Sexual Values Aligned, or Are You in 69? Which was a great, great workshop. And I was delighted to be able to attend and to get to meet you. So welcome to our show.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I'm excited to be here.
Good. That's wonderful. So I'd love it if you'd share a little bit about yourself in your own words with our listeners so they can get to know you a little bit better.
Yeah. So let's see. I grew up in a combination of places between New Mexico, Arizona, and Illinois. But after finding myself staring at disbelief at the wind chill factor on a bank clock in downtown Chicago, I made the choice to move back to Arizona and attend ASU for my undergrad. I studied psychology there with an emphasis in human sexuality. And then I moved to Colorado, where I worked in market intelligence at IBM, of all things, for a decade, while I was also going back to school and getting my master's and doctorate in psychology. I'd say over the course of my work, I took a strong interest in holistic sexuality across the lifespan. And I started to specialize more in the intersectionality of aging, chronic pain, and sexuality. So as you can imagine, this drew an interesting mix of issues and concerns to my clinical practice, one of which became an interesting number of individuals in the kink community who were using BDSM as a way to manage pain or somatic experiences in their body, and CNM or poly individuals who were struggling to navigate intimacy, boundaries, and communication in non-traditional ways that fit for them as life moved them through different stages of life. Mm-hmm. But the one thing that I kept noticing in each of these issues was that no matter how unique the contributing contexts were, there was a lack of an authentic sense of one's personal values to consistently navigate to what felt true for them. So a lot of the themes that I work with are around sexuality, and I started to look for research that would help define sexual values in particular. And I found surprisingly little in the literature from a therapeutic lens. So this led to identifying a framework to overlay what we do know about defining awareness of personal belief systems and values over the therapeutic challenges that I was seeing around relationships and intimacy, themes around sexuality. So understanding one's sexual values became even more important when we add the complexity of additional partners and their own competing sexual values. So the concept of how one might approach defining values aligned sexuality led to the talk that resulted where you and I met at Southwest Love Fest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was a really incredible talk. I'd never seen a talk given like that before. So I appreciate the time and the attention that you put in getting that all together. And also, I do practice consensual non-monogamy and polyamory, and one of my partners has a newer partner. So it was also very timely, just as I was kind of thinking through our sexual values and how it was creating some conflicts in some of our communication and in our relationships. So it was really, really timely. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
So I'd love it just to get to know you a little bit better and let our listeners get to know you. Maybe when to go back in time, if that's okay with you, if you think back to when you were growing up, like before you started to actually do this work as a career, was there a moment for you where you realized that maybe you were built a little bit differently, or maybe you thought about relationships or sexuality in a different way other than the other folks who are maybe around you at that time? What I call your light bulb moment, or maybe like a series of light bulb moments?
Yeah, I would say so. I would say that I've always been a super curious person, and I like to ask the why, and what if it isn't, and what if it doesn't, and what does that mean? And so this has both gotten me in trouble, and it's also helped me excel in various different contexts of my own personal and professional life. But one of the things that it kept leading me back to was how we can create these rigid expectations of ourselves based on expectations or assumptions, and how it's those rigid rules or contexts that we live in that really create a lot of breakdowns in communication and expectations around intimacy. So, for example, one of the consistent themes I hear in my clinical practice is the use of that internalized rule or a story of oneself that they create, that they should, or it's an all or nothing thought. And the problem is that if this type of internal perspective becomes too rigid, it leads to inflexible emotional responses or behavior expectations when that rule or story no longer serves us, or when we lack our own clarity about how to communicate it well as a boundary. So, for example, an individual might say, I must always agree with, or please, or can't say no, or I'm not as good as or fun as my sexual partner's other partners. When we find evidence then to support what we believe is right or true, but then we experience conflict when that rigid belief feels incongruent with one of our current experiences, actually having a difference of opinion or desiring something else around intimacy. And so I think that one of the benefits of me being that curious person is that, getting people to really look at the why and where does that come from behind those kinds of stuck rigid moments, because that results in a couple responses. We can either have an internal experience of negative self-talk or negative emotions, such as, gosh, maybe I'm a bad partner, or what's wrong with me, or why is this so much easier for other partners? I guess I'm just too insecure and I should just ignore my feelings. Or we can experience avoidance or withdrawal behaviors, such as I can't talk about my preferences or ask for what I need, or my partner will think I'm too needy or think that I need something else or different, and I'll hurt their feelings. I hear that one a lot. Or if I just keep overscheduling myself and I'm too tired and stressed for intimacy, then I can just avoid the conflict altogether. So my light bulb moment was really when I not only realized that we have to work to notice our internal rules and practice compassionate noticing and curiosity rather than judgment and criticism, or we'll never get out of our own way long enough to explore what rigid thinking is keeping us stuck in negative experiences or patterns in our relationship. So curiosity, I'll often ask, why shouldn't it? What if it isn't? Where did you learn that role? Does that choice work for you? For how long? Is it working long-term or just short-term relief because of that avoidance? And I often heard answers to these questions based in some version of someone else's values besides their own, or from intergenerational family culture or rigid rules handed to us by some external influence. And then we take those rules that were handed to us and we keep rewriting them instead of taking the time to stop and notice, what are we writing? And does it still serve us or our authentic self? Or if it ever did, or if there's still parts that very much do that we want to keep writing intentionally. So those internal rules and self-expectations become really rigid and complex. Then you overlay the complexities over another relationship, and it becomes a dance or a negotiation of compare and contrasting rules and expectations. And when you do that in a triad or agree or polycule, you can quickly get lost in navigating your own authentic values while trying to also consider your partner's values and needs, while also creating the flexibility to become and stay truly aligned with your own. So since then, I've been, I'd say, much more intentional about helping people drill down to their own sense of self, their sexual values, and the healthiest boundaries and communication approaches to maintain them in all of their relationships. So in that way, they're much more successfully armed to advocate for their own needs, desires, boundaries, and concerns in combination with their partners, and having a meaningful sexual values tapestry, if you will, of all parties that all parties can feel good about.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I love how you came from it, that curiosity, just that really started for you. So I'm curious, did you have that kind of framework of being really curious in like high school or early in college? Was it kind of always with you and then it kind of expanded outward from there?
Yeah. So fun fact. I actually went to college on an art scholarship and got kicked out of, I got asked to reconsider my major first semester because I was too curious. I found myself asking so many questions of it was actually a TA instead of the professor about, well, are you sure? And where does that come from? And I don't think it works like that. And, how do you know that? And I got asked to quickly reconsider my major. And so I went into psychology because I can ask tons of questions there and still do artwork.
That's so interesting. That's funny to me personally, because I actually went to school for art as well, graphic design. And I thought about minoring in psychology. And here I am now, like where career number one was graphic design and being a creative director. And now I'm a relationship coach. So it's just kind of funny that,
yeah, perfect.
Just different ways to get to serving this particular community that we're both serving in different ways, in different capacities. So yeah, I'd love to learn maybe a little bit more about what brought you to, like, why are you passionate, like, to do the work that you're doing now? Like, what was kind of the path that brought you there? So I understand. So first you were in art, then they asked you to change your major and you went into psychology. Maybe just tell me a little bit more about that path for you.
Yeah. So when I changed my major to psychology, I really went, I was still very much interested in human sexuality. And so I majored in, or emphasized in that area while doing general psychology. And then when I went to Colorado, I applied a lot of that curiosity and clinical skill around doing market intelligence. So figuring out from a totally different standpoint, how does the market respond to things, and how can you tease apart patterns and behaviors and buying behaviors? And it's a very different application of psychology. But I quickly realized, okay, my heart's not really in this. I'm still very much interested in mental health and helping people. So went back to school. And what quickly started happening is that a lot of people really don't like working with intimacy or working with couples. And so I wound up in my internships getting all of the referrals for those spaces and just couldn't get enough. Really loved to work in that place. And so when I went back for my doctorate, kind of took the time to explore other fields, working with children, working with the elderly, working with chronic pain in the hospitals, and really started to realize that I kept focusing back in my original area of human sexuality, and interestingly started to see a huge alignment of aging issues around sexuality, chronic pain with aging, and how it's impacting sexuality. And so a lot of the detours that I took, even though they were detours, they still very much kept leading me back to a central theme around where I really felt like I could be helpful. And so I do a lot of work now in that space around chronic pain and aging, around intimacy, and considerations for going through menopause, through shifting the expectation of what intimacy should look like through aging versus what we thought it was in our 20s. And so it's been a really cool educational process for me.
That's neat. I don't remember ever speaking to somebody who specialized in aging, chronic pain as it relates to sexuality, and as it maybe overlaps the BDSM and the consensual non-monogamous community. It's really, really interesting. is there kind of like a demographic almost, or certain age groups or certain recurring things that you happen to notice in your work, like of who you're working with?
Yeah, I would definitely say that from a demographic standpoint, I tend to see more individuals who are early to midlife, kind of right in the middle between maybe 30 and 60. And the reason I say that is a broad sense of midlife is I don't tend to see so much the individuals who are just figuring out who they are and what it means to be in a relationship. I tend to really work with the complex situations where individuals are really sure of what they want to become, what they want to continue to invest their time and energy in because it's a part of their values and their identity, and how to make that meaningful and with healthy boundaries and communicate that in a way that they don't just become whoever their partner is, as I often see developmentally more in your 20s. And so I also see kind of the transitional phases of sexuality. So people who are going through empty nest, retirement, health issues that affect sexuality, menopause. And so people who are going through somewhat of an identity crisis around how does my sexuality need to shift, or does it in that space? And so I tend to work with the people who are really in that I'm trying to figure out what is important to me. What are my values? How do I want to be certain that I'm being purposeful and intentional in intimacy and in my life at this point?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's fascinating. And again, timely. I happen to be 54. And literally as of months ago, I've started to move through the change, the life change. And that's been quite interesting with the hot flashes and little things that I'm noticing, like my joints are starting to feel different. So it's timely just, noticing all of that. And my partners are around the same age as me. And I've been with my husband 2 decades. So that's a lot of time for us to watch as our bodies age, what that looks like and what happens. And my other partner, he's again, about the same age. He's 53. And he currently still is riding a bike 10 miles into his job and 10 miles back out. And I'm just curious. I know, it's amazing, but I wonder, he's not going to retire for a number of years. And I'm curious to see how his body keeps up with that, over time, because I definitely get more worried about him. So I think it's interesting just to be having this conversation about aging and multiple relationships. And in a way, I view polyamory as a different way to form families, because my husband and I found out we were infertile. We don't have children. So, which is another aging issue when you think about it, because we started to have kids too late, and our bodies were like, yeah, you should have started that earlier, but we hadn't met yet, So I think it's just interesting the way that you're helping people. And I want to go back to something that you said too. I loved that curiosity, the way you described it as compassionate noticing. I thought that was really beautiful from a really non-judgmental place, because I think a lot of the people that I work with, they tend to get to a place where they're shaming themselves or beating themselves up. And it's still important to have that awareness and that noticing, including, like you said, those rigid rules or those shoulds, like shoulding all over ourselves is what I often say. Yeah. Instead of that compassionate noticing. So I just wanted to highlight that was a really beautiful way to say that. One thing I'd love to ask about is, you mentioned that sometimes people you work with are using BDSM to manage pain. I've heard of that concept, but not really had a broad discussion on it. Can you maybe elaborate a little bit more on how that may show up, or how you've seen that context in relationships?
Yeah, well, interestingly, there's a lot of neuroscience that goes behind BDSM, and there's a lot of neuroscience that's happening when our bodies are in chronic pain. And there is a distinction between acute pain response and chronic pain in the way that the body responds. And so individuals who tend to be in chronic pain don't often have the autonomy to be able to manage the experience of that pain, or what might cause them relief, or how to create the body's natural response of hormones and chemicals to be able to mediate some of that experience. And so a lot of the times in BDSM, either through sensory deprivation or through impact play or through different types of sensations, the body can respond with an increased level of endorphins and norepinephrine and dopamine and the things that make us manage pain in our bodies. And so it becomes a really beautiful dance between taking back some of that autonomy to be able to basically experience that pain on their own terms, or to get relief from pain in a different way through a different version of the way the body responds to purposeful pain. And so it's it can also create a level of kind of a flood in the body that helps to the pain receptors to respond differently, or the what's called the pain gates to close in a different way. And so it can kind of create a reprieve from some long-term stress in the body that you couldn't get in a normal day-to-day context. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I've seen it do some really amazing things in that space.
Mm-hmm. So some of the main ideas I'm getting from that is taking back the autonomy so that they have a little bit more of a sense of agency about how they're maybe experiencing that pain, or maybe almost changing their relationship to it in a way, both mentally, psychologically, but also physically. Am I hearing that right?
Yep, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
And so sometimes you may be helping people just maybe understand that a little bit more, or process it more, or maybe if one of the partners has chronic pain and the other one doesn't, helping them maybe do that dance together, whether it's safe words or creating empathy or understanding around that. Is that kind of how you're helping people?
Yeah, it's a lot of offering education and validating that experience from a chronic pain standpoint. And I think it's confusing for a lot of people to say, oh my gosh, I'm in pain and I'm creating this context where I'm creating more of it, and so am I crazy? So really understanding the neuroscience behind what's going on and how that may be providing profound benefits, not for all people, but for people who really can sink into that kind of that subspace and that hormonal release that creates oxytocin and all the things that really help the body to heal and repair.
Mm-hmm. That's beautiful. Well, that sounds like incredibly rewarding work. I'd love to just ask you, in that realm of the work that you do, what would you say is the most rewarding thing about it, and maybe the most challenging?
Specific to, I would actually say, I was going to answer specific to working with BDSM kink, but as I think about it, I think my answer is a little bit more holistic as far as what is the reward and the challenge of the overall facets of all the things that I work with. Because one of the most challenging things I think I see across the board in all of those domains is people really understanding their sexual values and why it matters. Because we don't tend to consciously define our sexual values until we're exposed to things that make us question that stance. And our risk preferences are often determined by our values. And so understanding, why am I leaning into that? Why does that scare me? Why am I experiencing jealousy in that regard? Why do I respond the way that I do to this? Why do I want this, but then I'm still self-sabotaging it? A lot of those things, whether that's pain, whether that's kink, whether that's poly, whether that's just even understanding your own intimate relationship with yourself, drilling down to the challenge of what matters to you. What do you want it to look like? What doesn't feel good to you? What would you like to ask for, but have all of those internal rules that say what it should look like or shouldn't? Because it's important to understand those values, because they shape our core beliefs, our priorities, our communication, our thoughts, our expectations, our behavior patterns, our judgments, our assumptions. Like, it's so much. So they're really linked to our personal feelings about what is acceptable, what's desirable, And they really help with conversations about consent and fulfillment and emotional safety and compatibility.
Mm-hmm.
So they really help navigate those talks with our partners about each other's beliefs and feelings and needs and what turns us on, what turns us off, what are our boundaries. So really getting people to drill down to those values, I think is the most challenging thing, because I don't think people think of values when they come in with a communication problem or an insecurity or jealousy or fears about opening a relationship. And as far as when jealousy or insecurities issues come up, it's really important to recognize that all emotions and thoughts are neither good or bad. They're right or wrong. It's simply an internal experience that we should notice, we should allow, we should approach with curiosity, with compassion, and to ask, what do we need to communicate to stay in alignment with what we want from or need from our relationship, or we want it to be in that moment. Because I often hear that stuck thinking around jealousy, such as, the only way to manage my jealousy is if I keep tabs on how much time they spend with me versus their other partners, or if they seem to be having more fun with or more fulfilled with me versus the metamors. And with a self-aware, non-judgmental approach, this can absolutely be reframed as, I can notice my jealousy, I can let go of attempts to control it. I can focus on the present moment interaction with my partners and what's important or special or valued without comparison. And that present tense mindfulness approach really helps people to set aside the difference between conflict and judgment, and just, yep, I'm human and I can communicate through this.
Mm-hmm. Beautifully said. And I love how you started to speak about jealousy and insecurity, and just, again, kind of having that compassionate noticing and being able to just be really present in the moment and realize that our emotions are giving us valuable information. We don't necessarily have to run away from those emotions. As a matter of fact, that can be really unhealthy. Just get,
Sure,
to your point, get really curious, your earlier point, and just lean into them to understand where they're coming from. That was beautiful. So I think that's a nice segue into maybe touching a little bit on your workshop. Are your sexual values aligned? Or in 69, would you like to give maybe like a little bit of an overview, and then we could drill down a little bit in that, if that's okay?
Yeah, sure. So the talk that I gave at Southwest Love Fest was very much about trying to overlay that framework of how do we talk about sexually aligned values in a way that is a little bit structured instead of really nebulous and unclear. And so taking something abstract and making it a little bit more concrete. And one of the theoretical frameworks that I work in is ACT, or acceptance and commitment therapy. And it really walks people through very specific areas of noticing what's going on as far as your own thoughts, your own internal experiences, your emotions, your urges, and how are those things either keeping you stuck or moving you towards what's important to you. And so it's really about being able to notice when you're stuck, figure out why, and then figure out how do you create values aligned choices that move you through that without having to say, I can't experience that discomfort, or that any negative feeling is bad, and judging it. It's really creating flexibility through our experiences and being able to navigate regulating instead of stuckness. So when I started speaking about this in other areas around anxiety or depression, for example, I just really started to feel like this explains so well the values aligned living that I talk about with people around sexuality. Mm-hmm. And so the talk where you and I met was very much about explaining that we tend to know what our values are at a high level. We tend to be awful at knowing what our sexual values are. And it's really important to understand that distinction, because that defines relationship and intimacy and connection and our own expectations of our body image and what feels like healthy communication and emotional intimacy. So if we don't have a good sense of that, and we're so high level that our values are really just be a good person, how does that really show up to what is good intimacy? So getting people to think through, how did you learn about intimacy? What did you learn about it? What are the internal messages that you grew up with based on orientation, gender, societal norms, family culture, religion, and how has that created some of those internal rules that we were talking about earlier? Mm-hmm. And so being able to think through various domains of how we identify sexuality, and then being able to really look at walking people through, how might you get stuck? What would that look like? How might individuals who are worrying about past relationships or future insecurities, or getting stuck in their own judgments about body image or sexual performance or health issues, how can they recognize their own avoidance behaviors and how that might be contributing to relationships not moving forward in communication, jealousy issues, and when other dynamics are added into and complicate interactions and time and needs. And then how do we create a more flexible story about ourselves so that we can say, I feel this and I'm still okay, or I can have that emotion and communicate it and still be loved. And so really being able to use that framework to teach people how to move through that. And then ultimately being able to notice when that's going on internally, make room for it, allow for it, and then also let it move through you in a way that doesn't just hijack you and shut you down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. That was a beautiful overview. And I love how you kind of tied it back to some things that we were talking about earlier. When we talk about our sexual values being aligned or possibly not, can you speak to like if there is an incompatibility, or like what type of non-negotiable boundaries or deal breakers could come up that could, especially when we're talking about multiple relationships, that could, I don't know if the word red flag is the right thing to say, but just when there might be some concerns about if people may not be compatible or they're kind of feeling stuck. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, sure. I tend to see that more when... So let me clarify. There's a difference between rigid thinking and clear boundaries that are not aligned, right? So, for example, I can have a rigid expectation of, well, where I see this often is the individuals who move from a non-hierarchical relationship in poly to a hierarchical one. And so there can be, or I guess the other way, when people are first opening up from a monogamous relationship, they often have this very hierarchical lens of, I'm the priority as your primary partner. And then when they open up and they invite others into that relationship and they start to normalize need and time and resources and expectations, that can really challenge that initial power dynamic from a hierarchical standpoint. And so being able to recognize what is the difference between, can I both and be inclusive of other partners and still have a healthy relationship with everyone involved? Or does it mean that I'm suddenly at risk, less than, not loved as much, that it's the competition, right? And so all those emotions that can come up that create a lot of fear and conflict. So that would be maybe a place where we can talk through creating some flexibility. Can you create some flexibility in the or and in addition to, instead of maybe, I am only willing to open up if it is more of a maybe a swinging situation, or it is more of a hall pass situation where I really don't want to create inclusivity at a kitchen table type of relationship with all of our partners. And so if that is a really firm belief system, that it should be, that's what's important to that person. And so if another partner starts to make assumptions about what that should shift to, that can create a real internal conflict around values. So, really and that can be hard to tease apart, because it really does go back to looking at what are the fears, what are the core beliefs, what are the internal rules, and really defining, because only that person can define what matters to them, what is comfortable for them. And that can be changing. That can be a developmental curve that can be, firm at one point and flexible at others. But you still have to be really clear about what's coming up for you and why, so that you can be aligned with your choices in that space at that time.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah. And I'm glad you touched on something there that I was going to bring up, which is whether I've seen this with in my own life, in my own relationships, or also even with people that I work with. Sometimes there can just be different desires, where one person desires kitchen table poly, which is very kind of inclusive, and that may be how they source safety, if you will. Maybe they value transparency, whereas somebody else might value more parallel polyamory, where those relationships are not overlapping. And that may be aligning with that person's need for privacy or their own sense of autonomy about how they build relationships. But there can be like some big clashes there that I've noticed, again, both in my own life and with my own clients. And I think, given what you said too about flexibility versus rigidity, it seems to me like if one or both are just really, really rigid, well, that's where a lot of conflict can come up, or some feeling stuck, like we don't know how to move forward, versus really honoring each person's needs and values. But it can be a deal breaker, is what I've seen. I mean, can you expand on that at all?
Well, you're right. Yeah. Flexibility doesn't mean that you should be okay with anything. But again, if you don't know what your sexual values are, then how do you know when you're allowing things that are not congruent to who you are, that are not authentic for you? And so, yeah, it's just super important to have a clear sense of what are my yes, no's, and maybes, and what are your yes, no's, and maybes. And so I reserve the right to check in frequently and see if any of those answers are changing. But I also reserve the right to be clear about what mine are and not adopt yours. And sometimes there's compromise, and sometimes there's just a lot of communication and boundary setting. And sometimes people do have to go their own way. Some people may really have specific intimacy needs or kinks or time demands that they really want to do, that they're really structured around, that someone else may want more inclusive time, more involvement, more play in the bedroom, more communication. And really, that's not different from any relationship. It just becomes more complex when you add multiple partners with multiple needs and multiple values. And nothing is right or wrong or good or bad. You just have a really clear sense of what's going to cause you an emotional flinch that doesn't feel right for you, so that you can be really clear about why, and how do you talk through that to figure out, is this a deal breaker, or can we figure out a compromise?
Yeah. Thank you for expanding on that a little bit more. And one thing I've seen is when we're talking about like sexual values, is when to like safer sex, like when to fluid bond, when not to fluid bond, how to have those kind of conversations, need to know versus want to know, with that type of information. And I think that's also where it can be really important to get clear on where you are. Like, what are your non-negotiables? What are your need to knows? Do you need to know if your partner is using condoms or not? What about fluid bonding? Is there anything you can expand on that particular topic?
Yeah, that particular topic actually comes up quite a bit. And one of the stuck thoughts, if you will, or stuck judgments that I often hear is that if you're not fluid bonded with your partner, then you don't really love them. And really getting people to look at, are you sure? Is there any other possible outcome of that? And where does that come from? What if it isn't? What if that isn't true? And what did that mean for you and your relationships? So really getting people to consider a reframe in that regard, so that it creates more flexibility instead of stuckness. For example, I can have a healthy boundary around sexual considerations and still have deeply fulfilling and intimate connections with my partners.
Mm.
And so being able to again, figure out what are those stuck points? Where can you create flexibility to be able to navigate that more fluidly? No pun intended there.
Yeah, exactly.
But also, where can you not? What how do you also pay attention to, no, this is a really firm belief for me, and I know where it comes from. I know why I believe it, and so it's not a compromise, and that's totally fine too. But being clear about, is this a stuck point, or is this a boundary?
I think that's a beautiful, beautiful distinction, and I think that's where also doing this work, you're like journaling and having maybe working on any self-esteem issues and confidence can be important too. Because sometimes I think people either might not have any clarity about what their boundaries or their values are, or maybe they don't have the confidence to really share that. For example, like, I think it's interesting, this concept of flexibility versus like a non-negotiable boundary is really interesting, and staying curious, but then holding a line if that's what feels good. For example, like with fluid bonding, what I've seen sometimes is maybe one person just simply has a boundary around, hey, we're fluid bonded, and I'm not really comfortable if, without knowing this other person, like if you just become fluid bonded with them, A, I need to know that, but B, I'm not comfortable with that. Like I think some of it is a distinction about, and maybe it's a question for you, is it reasonable if we get to a non-negotiable, or we're like, hey, this is where I'm at, this is my non-negotiable, take it or leave it, versus flexibility? Like, is there like a tipping point where we might realize, oh, maybe I'm just being really, really rigid, or versus, no, this is my deal. This is my non-negotiable boundary. This is my belief system for my own sense of safety. Because I think that's interesting too. Like the idea of safety is really interesting, whether it's our physical safety, our sexual safety versus our emotional safety, and getting clear on what that looks like. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I don't think it's fair to define a tipping point per se versus what feels right for you. And the reason I make that distinction is I don't know what your tipping point is. It may be different than my tipping point, but what I think is really valuable is to be able to really pay attention to the why. And what I mean by that is, oftentimes when I will say, well, why do you believe that? Where did that come from? A lot of the times I will get, I don't know, I just do. And maybe that's a place to explore flexibility versus, this is why I believe that. This is why it's important to me. Okay, great. Now you know. Mm-hmm. So just having a really clear sense of what is important to me and why, I think sometimes is enough. And you can reserve the right to reevaluate that at any point down the road. And for now is just fine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that seems reasonable and sound, including the keeping the communications lines open. Like, this is where I'm at right now. This is why this is important to me right now, instead of maybe that global answer, just because, like right. staying again in curiosity instead of, because to me that seems either non-self-reflective or possibly rigid,
fear.
Yeah. Or fear. Mm-hmm. That's really interesting. Anything that I haven't asked you that you would like to maybe expand on, either in relation to the workshop? Are your sexual values aligned or in 69, or anything else that you'd like to share?
Well, one of the things that I keep getting asked is if I have a workbook or journal prompts from that workshop. I'm still getting that question. And so I am working on that because it has been requested several times, and it would just be something that walks partners through clarifying their sexual values and recognizing areas of overlap, areas of boundaries, areas for further communication. And so I'll be developing those materials in the coming months, and we'll be posting those online for download. I'll post a link on my Instagram account when those are available.
That would be wonderful. And if you happen to remember, if you let me know, I'll have a link to your website on the show notes. But I'm also happy to put a direct link when you do come up with that, because I think that would be super duper valuable. I loved your workshop and I thought it was really needed.
Well, thanks.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Well, thank you for that. And I'd love to maybe just take you through what I call the lightning round, and then we'll start to wrap up. Does that sound good?
Yep.
Okay. So lightning round is just a few fun, quick questions. So what would you say is the best thing that you've done maybe along your journey of living your most authentic life in a way that works for you?
No. That's a good question. So I'm back to curiosity. So
That's all good.
if I were to continually challenge myself to ask around my own authenticity, if I were living my authentic truth consistently, how might I show up differently in my life, in my relationships with myself, and around my sexuality? And I think being able to just frequently ask that, if I were to be consistently authentic, would anything be different? And it's a good kind of barometer to check in and a compass to see, am I out of alignment?
Mm-hmm. It's a beautiful question. I love that. How about if somebody came to you and they were saying, I am thinking about opening up my relationship, or maybe they are getting more clear that they identify in the LGBTQ plus community. Is there any advice that you would give them if they're maybe at the beginning of that journey that they're embarking on to help them?
Yeah. One of the things I'm often asked by individuals who are new to or considering E&M is what's the most rewarding aspect of living an ethically non-monogamous lifestyle? And after spending some time in session doing that values clarification that we've been talking about, I often turn that question back to them and say, you tell me. Because it can be really powerful for someone to clarify what their meaningful relationship experiences, needs, beliefs, and desires are. And it can be really freeing to explore fulfilling those values and making sure that all their relationships are aligned with that authentic self. Because it's not uncommon for individuals to have different relationships or roles or different interests or facets in our own personalities. So for couples living outside of a mononormative lens, the approach to that values-aligned living allows for having multiple deep, meaningful, loving relationships that support those different facets of your values, beliefs, needs, desires. But it comes from the perspective that all of those things don't need to come from one partner. And if I were just to give like the elevator pitch tip there, it would really be to just communicate about everything, over communicate. Practice that curiosity and compassion in all your experiences, and give yourself permission to course correct as you learn and grow.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. I love that. How about, is there a book, movie, or resource that either helped you along your journey that you would like to recommend here for our listeners?
I think a really pivotal book for me in my own journey in this space was Esther Perel's Mating in Captivity. And it was really pivotal both professionally and personally, because it really challenged me to look at how we come to believe what we do about the roles that we play in relationships, and how that can lead to those rigid stories that ultimately impact our ability to cultivate eroticism in our sexuality. There was a time where we didn't really need one partner or even three partners to do all the things. We had a whole village, a whole community, a whole extended family to play different parts. And now we expect all of these hats to be worn by our romantic partners. And it sometimes is really hard to ask someone to pay the mortgage and, change the diapers and take me out on a fun date, and then also be super sexy and erotic in the bedroom. So being able to really look at how are you also creating some expectations of yourself in that space, so you can show up how you want to be in each of them instead of living those compartmentalized expectations.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. I love that. Yeah. And I That book has been on my reading list for some time now, and you're like the fifth person recently who's recommended it to me. So I need to finally get it in the queue so that I read it. I love Esther Perel. And then lastly, for fun, is there a particular song or type of music that really moves you?
That's a super tough question because music is my soul space for sure. There's so much to pick from. It may sound strange, but I always return back to U2's With or Without You because it has held so many different meanings across my life. But specific to the work that I do around sexuality, I think it's equally as relevant a reminder that we come into this world, into our bodies, and we say, I pick you, this body, this soul, this lifetime, these emotions to live this journey with. But so often we then spend that lifetime beating that chosen partner up and ridiculing them with self-criticism and shame and judgment and fear. And then that song to me is a reminder that we can live this life authentically with or on our own terms and our own best cheerleader or without, not being authentic and making our own experiences harder than they may already be. So always choose with. And if you aren't, ask yourself if that's aligned with your values.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. And I'm a huge U2 fan, so I love that as well. Awesome. So where can everyone find you and your work? This has been just a beautiful conversation.
Yeah. So you can find me on Instagram at Holistic Sexuality or online at Spectrum Wellness AZ for Arizona.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your work that you're doing for our wider community, whether that's the LGBTQ+, the CNM community, the BDSM and kink community. I really respect your work and appreciate you taking the time to have an incredibly interesting conversation with me here today.
Thanks. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for tuning in to today's show. If you like what you heard, are struggling with some aspect of your relationships, and you're interested in seeing if you're a fit to work with me as your relationship coach, here's what I invite you to do next. Head over to lovingwithoutboundaries.com/apply. That's lovingwithoutboundaries.com/apply and book a call to speak with me. I'll get on the phone with you for about 45 minutes and we'll get you crystal clear on 3 things. Number 1, exactly what's not working well in your relationships right now. Number 2, ideally where you'd like to be and what might be getting in the way. And number 3, the exact strategy to get you there, helping to close that gap. Remember, creating healthy, open relationships does not typically happen by itself. Many often need expert guidance to make it happen. We've helped clients all over the world to feel safe, happy, and secure in open relationships, while not losing their mind or their cherished partners. To see if we can help you do the same, head over to lovingwithoutboundaries.com/apply. I'm Kitty Chambliss, and let's talk soon.